Wow, that was nice.
Uglies ended with Tally undergoing the pretty procedure, but only to serve as the guinea pig to Maddie's cure for the pretty lesions. And in the last scene of Uglies, Tally resides with the other pretties in the city, touching the scar on her hand before smiling for the camera. Today on Screen Rant, let's take a deep dive into how the story could continue in Uglies 2.
It's time for you to make a choice. Are you staying or not?
As those who've read Scott Westerfeld's novels know, Uglies is just the beginning of a 4-novel series. Indeed, it's currently unclear whether a sequel will happen, but the first film's finale sets up the events of a potential follow-up. After Uglies focused on the struggles of the eponymous lower caste, Uglies 2, based on pretties, would move up the social stratum to reveal life in the city. Spoiler alert, Tally doesn't immediately return to the rebels to test Maddie's cure. Instead, she is enamored by her life in the city as a new pretty. The story begins with Tally deciding what to wear to a city bash, where she's slated to get voted into the pretty clique called Crims. So while many of the original cast members would return, this includes Zane, the leader of the Crims and Tally's love interest in pretties. There's also Crims member Fausto, the rebels Sussy and Dex, and a holy man called Andrew Simpson Smith, who has a brief but crucial part in the story's big twist. Meanwhile, most of the original cast would need to reprise their roles, including Tally, Dr. Cable, David, Maddie, Croy, and Shay, who would also be accompanied by her new clique members in the Cutters. As Netflix hasn't greenlit the sequel, it's also unknown whether the corresponding actors would reprise their roles or who could join the cast for Uglies 2. However, don't get us wrong, Joey King was perfectly cast for the lead role. She has both the looks and the acting chops to portray both ugly and pretty versions of Tally Youngblood. Cast members like Keith Powers and Brienne Chu, who respectively play David and Shay, are simply too conventionally attractive to be Uglies. On one hand, Uglies not actually being ugly evokes one of the book's core messages, that beauty standards are unjustly imposed by a central authority. On the other hand, it's just ridiculous that the supposed Uglies obviously look like supermodels, which defeats the whole conceit of how they could get tricked into the pretty procedure. And this isn't even the real controversy in the Uglies cast. The one trans actress in the cast, Laverne Cox, plays the villain Dr. Cable, who forces teens to undergo a harmful surgery. While Cox nails the role, Dr. Cable may be one of the worst characters in terms of being a vehicle for trans visibility. With all this in mind, Uglies 2 might recast some characters on top of the new cast members it needs to introduce. And if Uglies 2 stays faithful to the source material, the cast list is just one of the things that the sequel will need to expand. Based on the events in Pretties Indeed, Uglies 2 can really start playing with how Scott Westerfeld blends genres in the Uglies series. Unburdened by the world building that Uglies had to do, Uglies 2 will have so much more room to translate the wild and more unpredictable events in the second book. In Pretties, the Crims start pulling pranks that make the clique famous, including melting a hovering rink with alcohol and crashing a game. At a later celebratory bonfire in the city, Tally gets into a huge fight with her friend Shay, who notably became a pretty before Tally but was rejected from the Crims. And at Uglyville, which in the movie is just called the Dorms, Tally finds out that Shay founded her own unique clique with other Crim rejects. Before we continue, a trigger warning to our viewers. The next part of this video discusses self-harm. With that said, Shay's new clique is called the Cutters, and they cut themselves to counter the lesions from the pretty surgery. Combined with action set pieces like Tally and Zane hoverboarding out of a hot air balloon, the sequel would reveal so much more about this dystopian world. In fact, to be fair, the first movie already reveals that there's more to the pretty surgery, the real purpose of which is to impart lesions that make people easier to control. However, this wasn't enough for some viewers who thought the premise to be too shallow. Based on the events in Pretties, Uglies 2 could completely reverse these criticisms about Scott Westerfeld's world once and for all. Spoiler alert, near the ending of Pretties, Tally stumbles upon a moral dilemma that would also serve as the peak of the sequel's plot. After hoverboarding from a hot air balloon and crashing, Tally discovers a scientific reservation of primitive Rusties. Though these villagers aren't part of Dr. Cable's world of Uglies and Pretties, they serve a different purpose, as test subjects for specials and pretty scientists. And while the scientists treat the villagers like lab rats, they've also conducted successful experiments to reduce the human propensity for violence. On one hand, these experiments and the pretty surgery could be the only ways to control humanity's violent streak. On the other hand, they come at the cost of subjugating most of the population, either in a dystopian hell or in the artificial heaven of the city. And it doesn't end there. Later, it's revealed that Tally's brain eventually heals the lesions on its own, without her ever taking the cure. So Tally's very existence becomes proof that Dr. Cable's experiments are unnecessary, which in turn sets up the events of the next novels. While the first movie is highly comparable to many other YA dystopian IPs, Uglies 2 is where Westerfeld's unique take on post-scarcity sci-fi truly flies. This is where the series' seemingly ridiculous premise gets grounded in uncomfortably feasible reality, a viable future if humanity stays on its current path of hyper-vanity. At the same time, Tally's journey unravels the situation beyond its blacks and whites, challenging whatever moral standards the audience brings to the table. But while the first movie is not bad, Uglies 2 absolutely cannot repeat how Uglies squandered the unique potential of the premise. If the creative team behind Uglies 2 hopes to get a theatrical release instead of just being a Netflix exclusive, the sequel needs to live up to the source material's massive potential. And on that note, notably, the first movie's biggest change to the Uglies novel is how it introduced the white tiger orchid as a bioengineered invasive fuel source. Unfortunately, this part of the movie is ultimately unnecessary, as the backstory already covers the environmentalist angle. More importantly, the orchids pull focus from the main critique about beauty standards, which is what makes Uglies unique. And as the first movie didn't really circle back to the orchids in the third act, Uglies 2 could simply never mention them again and just stay faithful to the book. Moreover, in relation to how the sequel could improve upon adapting Westerfeld's novels, there is a lot of untapped humor, both in Pretty Culture and Dr. Cable's extreme devotion to conventional beauty, and Uglies 2 could fix this with clever dialogue, editing, or cinematography. If Uglies 2 properly translates the source material this time around, not only could it shut down the first movie's harshest critics.
Squint and nose. Forever, do you remember that?
Uglies isn't perfect, but it nonetheless sets strong foundations for the sequel to revolutionize YA dystopian sci-fi. In fact, one criticism about the movie is that it felt too crammed, part of which can be blamed on its limited runtime of 1 hour and 40 minutes. The sequel could fix this by utilizing a full 2 hours or more, which is not only more typical of feature films, but would also give Uglies 2 the room it needs to tell the story of Pretties. That said, this may be the hardest part of the adaptation to fix, as the movie's largely negative reception isn't ideal in terms of negotiating for a longer runtime. For now, it seems unlikely that Uglies 2 could enter development and get the green light anytime soon. But in the right hands, Uglies 2 could be a much-needed breath of fresh air in the currently oversaturated subgenre of dystopian sci-fi films. With the extremely negative overall reception of Uglies, do you think Uglies 2 can still happen? Tell us in the comments and keep watching ScreenRant.